Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 12. Decontamination. Earlier that evening, within a dark room close by, a man hid inside as he ducked under a window, mindful of the threat just outside. It was a cartel soldier, and this soldier was one of Santiago's lieutenants. He was wearing military fatigues as he held a rifle while clinging to the wall beneath the window. Although the room was darkened by nightfall, it was dimly lit by the silvery glows of moonlight shining through the remaining broken plates of glass. It was a small, empty space he had found, void of carpet or furniture, just thin wooden walls with hardwood flooring. He could barely make out the conversation, but was getting the gist of what was being said outside. There was no more gunfire, but he knew the threat was still there. He slowly positioned himself to see through the bottom right corner of the second-floor window. He was trying to keep his breathing down, attempting to quell the adrenaline that had recently overtaken him during his escape. As he peered through his corner of the window, he noticed a dim, dusty area mired in mud tracks where he once stood, dead bodies still strewn about, unable to make out who was who. All he knew is that his side had lost, and the dead bodies were likely his fallen comrades. He watched as flashlights and red sniper targeting dots darted around the darkened grounds below, near the truck he had recently parked with his two hostages in it, Delilah and Caleb. As he came closer to the window, he could hear faint conversations below, but it was one voice in particular that he was paying close attention to. a female voice that seemed to be the leader of this advancing American foe. It was apparent from her speaking that she was directing her words at the 4 prisoners he once held captive along with his fellow soldiers. "We haven't made our way to Esmeralda yet, so we're not exactly certain. But we do know the cartel leader was the infamous Lazar. Goes by the Chancellor now, though. Used to have him locked up in Colorado. According to our sources on the ground, him and a few of his men are personally seeking this revenge. If you come across this group, stay clear of them. They have a death wish. It's not good to be on this gangster's mind. They're seeking the group's leader himself." The voice he was listening to started to trail off. Perhaps the Americans were vacating, he thought. A few final, faint words were heard in the distance. "I believe his name is Trevor Meeks." This was a good thing, the cartel soldier thought to himself. They're leaving, and they're not taking Trevor and his family with them. In fact, they had no idea this was Trevor Meeks below. He wasn't sure why Trevor hadn't revealed himself to them, but he didn't care. He had to form a plan, and he had to form this plan quickly. The Chancellor would want revenge on whomever killed his brother. And seeing that the US military had moved in with overwhelming air and firepower, Trevor would definitely fit the profile of a consolation candidate. It could be his ticket to propel himself up the cartel ranks. He peered through the window and saw that the American threat had vanished and noticed Trevor and his group scrambling to depart as well. He gathered himself up and, feeling confident he wasn't going to be met by the Americans any longer, he quickly made his way downstairs. Then, he silently ran across a dark room with the most stealth he could possibly execute to a doorway leading out to his newest target, this relentless Trevor, and what little was now left of his team. Seeing a path, now clear of the recent American threat, the soldier quickly ran out onto the dirt ground, only to see the glow of red taillights driving away. Now, he had remembered he had left the vehicle running before his escape, and his target was quickly disappearing within it. As he spun around, slowly realizing he had no vehicles of his own, he aimed his gun at the distant and fading truck, but then thought to himself. He looked behind him in the direction he had heard the Americans head and hesitated. Finally, with a new strategy in his head, and not wanting to draw his enemies back to the sound of gunfire, he shouldered his weapon and ran into the darkness, heading toward the center of town to see if he could obtain another vehicle or even a horse. To his utter amazement, causing him to stop dead in his tracks, right around a building's corner, there in a darkened alleyway, stood a frightened horse tied to a metal post. He quickly mounted the panicked beast and calmed it by rubbing its mane. He then reached over, took out a knife, and cut the horse free as he guided it back to the bloody battlefield. And there, sitting upon his newly acquired mode of transportation, he looked one more time at where Trevor and his family had disappeared through the dense jungle surrounding the field and nearby buildings. As he thought of possibly catching up to the 4 targets, all escaping together once more, he pulled a flat device out of a pocket near his chest and looked at it. It was a small black device that he now held as he quickly studied it. Then, he peered back up to where his target had vanished and smiled. He gathered the horse's reins and gave them a quick tug and whistled for the beast to make haste. But instead of trailing the crippled team of 4 he once sought to contain, he speedily took off into the opposite direction. He was now heading toward Esmeralda, eventually disappearing into the shadowy wilderness himself, just beyond the streets of Volta Larga. Later in the morning, a sliver of sunlight began to peek over the Andes mountain range, submerging the small coastal community of Ton Supa in a calm amber light. The once dark, heavenly skies now held hostage ripples of sun rays across its vast, cloudy, and overcast prison. The atmosphere over the seas met with its counterparts, over the nearby woodland and whisked about a mild early morning storm. Gusts of winds traveled effortlessly across the jungle canopy, sending leaves into a flurried frenzy as they were swept from their lifelines of canopies below. Fluttering about, they would swirl this way and that. Some of them would dance in the air for longer, while most would simply succumb to their fate, landing on the cold ground below. It seems some would find their way to a man-made resting place, a desolate asphalt highway, the dense forest on one side and Tonsupa on the other. Laying there, peacefully resonating to the light storm above, they suddenly departed each other's company as a disturbance began to take hold. On the vacant, overgrown paved road, a familiar small military truck made its way upon the solid surface as the ever-changing morning sunlight washed over the Ecuadorian jungles. Adding to the light breeze through the nearby trees, another sound now echoed through the coastal woodlands as 6 cylinders within its metallic confines roared down the abandoned road. But as mechanical clanks began to interrupt the deep hum of this swiftly traveling vehicle, it ultimately slowed to a full stop along the abandoned expressway's shoulder, unable to accomplish furthering its journey onward. "Are we stopping?" Caleb asked as he sat in the back, next to his sister. Trevor, sitting in the driver's seat, looked at Beck next to him, then into the rearview mirror where he could see Delilah and Caleb. "I'm afraid so. That's as far as this one is taking us. We're gonna have to walk for a little bit," he replied, glancing back at Beck with slight worry in his eye. Caleb and Delilah smiled. They were just happy to be back with their 2 guardians. Beck looked over at her brother. "So, what's the plan?" Trevor thought for a moment. "This is the E15 south. Should take us all the way to Punta Blanca. We need to make sure we stay close to it. I say we walk alongside of it in the forest until we see another car. We're likely to find something." The car grew quiet as Beck and Trevor thought of ideas to strengthen the proposed strategy. Beck finally broke the silence. "Works for me. Let's go," she said as she turned her whole body to look at the kids. "Come on, guys. You want to go for a little hike?" The 2 kids smiled back at her as Delilah chimed in. "I get to be the leader." "No, I'm the leader," Caleb rebutted with disdain in his voice. Beck let out a small laugh. "You guys can take turns being the leader. Come on, let's get our things." With that, the 4 of them began to gather their mismatched duffel bags and backpacks together in preparation for their inevitable family outing. Both Trevor and his sister knew the gas would only get them so far. They were just praying to spot something before then. The alluring forest held a delicate splendor, as lush and leafy ivy meandered up and down the trees and across the scenic landscape. The earth was a dark brown and bragged of rich soil as small puddles gathered here and there. Trevor cautiously stepped through the low-lying foliage, a camouflage duffel bag on his side, while Delilah bravely led the group in front of him, wearing a beige backpack. Caleb was following directly behind, as Beck dutifully guarded the back of the line. Beck decided to lift the children's spirits with a game her and Trevor used to play on their own family outings. "You guys want to play a game?" Trevor, still walking, looked back at his sister and smiled as he knew what she was suggesting. "Yes," both kids exclaimed. The 4 kept walking through the forest alongside the highway as Beck began to explain the rules. Their voices faded as they made their way through the trees, beginning their long journeys ahead. "Okay, it's kind of like I Spy, but with a twist. It has to be something you can see. Can it be a tree?" Caleb asked. "Of course. But you don't describe it. You just say the first letter. Like T for tree. That's the twist. And you're not allowed to cheat," Trevor added. I don't cheat. Anyway, if someone requests one, you can give them the next letter. Like R after T and tree? Delilah asked. Yes, just like that. Whoever guesses the word gets a point for every letter left. Their voices finally faded away as they made their journey through the jungle's thicket. The forest now held a peaceful daylight glow, while rays of sunlight broke through the stormy clouds and transcended the thick leaves above. About a mile ahead, a slight clearing of trees about the size of a small softball field stood as a small obstacle of vulnerability to the four. And from this clearing, the sounds of the traveling family could be heard coming closer. L, Delilah guessed. Nope, quipped Caleb. I want a letter. You already got your letter. Plus, Uncle Trevor gave you his too. Everyone quiet, Trevor whispered as they approached a sudden end to their covered paths. Let's pause the game for a little bit, okay? He looked at Beck as she moved to where he was standing. He continued speaking, strategizing their next move. Doesn't seem like a problem, just a short time of being in the open. Beck was about to agree in response when they all heard a familiar sound in the distance. Is that a plane? She asked, looking at her brother. Trevor turned toward the open field and beyond the forest at the other end, where the noise seemed to be coming from. Sounds like aircraft. Jets. A few of them, he answered, looking toward the incoming noise with wonder. The noise grew louder and began to vibrate in their bodies as they surveyed the small patch of sky above them. Just then, as if they were close enough to touch, 2 military fighter jets flew over the forest they were hiding in, sending echoes of deep shockwaves that resonated within the four. Beck and Trevor threw a glance at each other with confusion and suspicion in their eyes. The four then began running toward the highway they had been skirting to visualize the aircraft's pathways. They made it to the edge of the asphalt, where they could once again see the planes, now far off into the distance. Suddenly, both jets made an immediate change in flight pattern as they both pitched straight up into the air. Beck and Trevor knew what to expect next as they each grabbed a child and braced themselves to the ground. Within seconds, a loud, thundering explosion resounded across the vast jungles. Still grasping a child each, Trevor and Beck looked over to see a plume of smoke work its way up into the atmosphere. Beck looked over at her brother. Esmeralda, Trevor, still looking at the distant explosion, slightly shook his head, signaling that her answer was close, but not completely accurate. Vuelta larga, he answered as he gathered himself back up. The 3 others followed his lead as they all looked off into the murky, overcast horizon, where the smoke was now gathering into a spherical-like shape. While standing alongside the highway in awe of the far-flung devastation the group had just witnessed, they all heard it at the same time. A sound of approaching vehicles from behind them. They all turned in unison to lay their sights on the sounds approaching them. It appeared to be a bus, though faint and far away. They could make out the bus's yellow siding and distinctive front grille. Immediately, without any need of formulating a plan and in complete lack of hesitation, the small family ran to the nearby woods to gain cover. A good 100 feet into the forest, the 4 hid behind a couple large trees that housed a large boulder in between them. They hid Caleb and Delilah behind the enormous rock as Trevor and Beck looked out to survey the unknown travelers. Eventually, the sound became louder as the vehicle approached, the sound of its engine filling them with anxiety. They waited there by the trees, completely still and silent as the bus finally came into view. To their dismay, the large vehicle seemed to slow as it pulled to the side of the road. Suddenly, making the situation much more dire, 2 large military trucks followed the bus directly behind it. They all came to a complete stop, led by the bus on the shoulder of the road, across the opposite side of the highway. Trevor looked over at Beck. You think they might have seen us? She just shrugged her shoulders and took off her backpack and placed it on the ground. She looked back at the kids and then into her bag while she began speaking to her brother. Those fucking Americans took all the guns from Santiago's men, so we're defenseless here. If they've seen us, we run, she said as she pulled out a pair of binoculars. Looking through them, she could see a few men get out of one of the trucks and approach the bus. Trevor, straining his eyes, could see them too. He didn't forget to comfort the kids as he looked over and threw them a smile. Just stay quiet. We'll be on our way soon. They looked up at him and nodded their heads, then sat down together behind the rock. Trevor continued to squint his eyes and see what Beck was seeing. Then his sister spoke up in a hushed manner. "They're American." Trevor straightened up and responded. "No problem then, right?" Beck, still peering through her binoculars, replied, "I don't know. Something's not right here. Stay quiet," she answered. They both knew that the American forces were focused on their jobs and secretive about their objectives as well. They also knew that they wouldn't hesitate removing any foreseeable obstacles from their paths. So as they studied the scene before them begin to play out, they did so quietly. They then could hear the Marines in the distance, shouting to people on the bus. They appeared to be ordering everyone off as passengers slowly began to disembark. Beck then quietly spoke to her brother. "They look like the people that lived in those open pastures," she said, handing Trevor the binoculars. He took them into his hands and placed them to his face as he viewed the drama unfolding across the unused lanes of highway. He saw a bunch of Hispanic women and children in tattered clothing unboarding as they were all being shouted at by the officers. "It's just women and children," he said as he continued to watch them follow orders. They all lined up along the length of the bus as a few Marines walked a few feet away and faced them as if they were about to address the group. Trevor watched on as one officer began shouting to the group, unable to hear exactly what was being said as they were too far away and not speaking English. Suddenly his heart dropped and his veins ran cold, a feeling he was getting all too familiar with. In sheer horror, they watched the three soldiers raise their weapons as they placed a relentless rapid fire among the innocent crowd. There was no screaming to be heard, as it was over within just a few seconds. The passengers from the bus now lay in a bloody disarray of lifeless human bodies. Trevor quickly scrambled with his sister as they ducked behind the rock and held the kids close to them, all of them now sitting against the large boulder. Trevor looked over at his sister as she spoke to him. "They're just killing them all like sick cattle." Trevor put his hands to his forehead and forcefully wiped his brow, attempting to calm himself down. Hearing his sister's words and in agreement with her conclusions, he looked over at her to respond. But before he was able to speak, they suddenly heard more aircraft screech across the sky above. The four of them looked up, but could not see anything as the leafy canopy was too thick. Realizing what was about to happen, they looked at each other and grabbed the kids closer to a huddle once more, bracing for an imminent blast. And within seconds, additional aerial fire hitting the earth off in the distance violently shook the soil beneath them as they all clutched each other tightly. Trevor finally responded to his sister's most recent comment. Decontamination. Earlier, that very same morning, a subtle mist poured through the low-lying fauna as faint streams of silvery light meandered through the jungle. A slight buildup of moisture in the air left a sparkling condensation over a grassy bank leading up from the woodland to the streets of Esmeralda. Just past an overgrown patch of asphalt, where the wild met with the nearby cement jungle, a cartel soldier riding horseback quickly navigated himself through the corridors of the eerily quiet coastal town. The cartel soldier had quickly made his way through the connecting jungles, leading him from one town to the next. While moving swiftly, He minded the forest for any adversaries in his path or possible surroundings. While maintaining caution and keeping guard, it had taken him a few hours to complete the journey, as the early morning dawn began to show signs of a small impending storm above. The morning twilight gave the soldier a sense of ease as he made the last leg of his small expedition through the streets of Esmeralda. The Chancellor's citadel was about 300 feet in front of him as it came into view upon rounding a building's corner. He noticed the gates ahead at the capital were open, and most of the Chancellor's vehicles were lined up on the streets outside. Many of his fellow cartel men were working alongside Russians, about 50 or so all together, loading the vehicles. He knew immediately they were heading for higher ground, sensing the incoming threat from their adversaries, which had infiltrated their neighbor to the north. The Chancellor's scouts must have informed him of the American insurgents. He had barely escaped. As he closed the distance between himself and the large complex of Spanish buildings, he noticed residents staring at him from the windows of nearby dilapidated houses. He then observed a few looks from some of the men scurrying about as he approached the grounds of the cartel and Russian stronghold, now just a stone's throw away. Gonzalez, a man, spoke firmly from within the men working to hasten their departure. Everyone froze, including the cartel soldier now approaching on horseback. He looked at the militarized crowd, now parting way for the man who yelled his name. Eventually, the Chancellor appeared in front of him, an armed soldier by his side. The Chancellor continued to speak. "Where are your men? What of my brother?" Gonzalez, the man on the horse, looked at the Chancellor and let his face fall, communicating to him wordlessly of his brother's fate. The Chancellor did not react. He just looked at the horseman as an expression of rage began to take hold of his face. Nevertheless, he continued to speak to Gonzalez. "Come, tell me more." He slipped from his horse and landed on his feet on the earth below, while keeping his gaze intently on the Chancellor. As he gathered his words within his mind, he respectfully approached his former boss's brother. "It was an ambush, sir. Our entire defense was caught off guard. We had secured the insurrectionists, all three of them. Eduardo brought them to us through a plot your brother had come up with a few days ago. When we were executing the rebels as you ordered, we were taken by American soldiers on both sides of us, but not before we were able to execute one of them. I believe your brother was killed first. He was probably their main target at that location, sir. I'm sorry, sir, but I wanted to get to you as soon as possible and warn you of the threat." A Russian soldier stepped forward and looked at Gonzalez with disgust. Then he looked over at the Chancellor and said something in Russian.
«Предатель».
The Chancellor exchanged glances with the Russian as his facial expression grew more stern. He looked back at Gonzalez and urged the nervous soldier to continue. "Go on." Gonzalez continued, but before he could speak, he noticed someone descending the Capitol steps. He did not know this man personally, but he did know of him. It was a taller, thin American man with blonde hair and blue eyes. He knew his name was Horatio, and he knew that he was well acquainted with the Chancellor and was Kent's son. He finally shook the distraction and began to speak. "After the Americans had retracted, I tried to recapture the prisoners, but the Americans had cut them loose, and they had already fled in my vehicle." "Please tell me, Gonzalez," the Chancellor stated. "The one that you executed was Mr. Meeks." "No, sir. It was the other man with him." "His friend, sir," Gonzalez replied. The Chancellor's eyes flashed with anger and gave a telling look to Gonzalez that his story was not going well and that there had better be some good news in store, or things might end badly for the soldier. Gonzalez took his cue without hesitation, proudly announcing his silver lining. He withdrew the small handheld device from his pocket. He looked at it and smiled, then looked up at the Chancellor. I know their exact location, sir. The Chancellor looked down at the device his soldier held as his eyes slightly widened and a slow, mild smirk grew from his lips. He walked up to his soldier and firmly grabbed his shoulder with one hand in a manner that spoke of reward. With his other hand, he took the handheld device from Gonzalez and looked at it. With one more large smile, he began to speak so that everyone around could hear him. This is a job well done, Lieutenant. Everyone here should take notice of the Lieutenant's good work. Gonzalez nervously smiled, looking at his boss smiling back at him. Then he watched as the Chancellor leaned in for a more private dialogue, as his face became fierce with rage once again, melting his delighted disposition away with it. The Chancellor spoke once again, this time only slightly above his own breath. If my brother is dead, Gonzalez, then why are you here? Just then, a gunshot sounded off and was met with the splattering of blood all over the Chancellor's face. Gonzalez, now clinging to his last few breaths, dropped heavily onto the soil at the Chancellor's feet. The Chancellor then looked down at the dying man with indifference, while putting his pistol back in its place under his belt behind him. With that, he gathered his leader-like composure and turned to Horatio. "Horatio!" he yelled as he tossed the device to him. "I have my hands full with these ridiculous Americans. Consider your mentoring over. I have 2 tasks for you now." The Chancellor spoke while his volume decreased as he approached the boy half his age. "These people, this Trevor Meeks, it's your responsibility now. Remember," he continued as he looked over the crowd of his men and then back at Horatio. "This man and his group hung your own father and his 2 men right here on these grounds." The Chancellor then leaned into Horatio and said in a whisper, "Make them bleed." Horatio smiled as he pocketed the device, then posed a question to his mentor. "And the second task, sir?" The Chancellor took a pistol from around his back and handed it to Horatio. He stepped closer to the young man and put an arm around his shoulder and announced to the crowd, "Nobody calls my men traitors." He then looked to the Russian, who spoke a single word to him minutes ago, and continued, "Even if they are." With that, Horatio accomplished his second task first. He lifted his pistol and shot the outspoken Russian from earlier, right between the eyes. The Russians in the group loudly rejected the brazen show of force, but were soon quelled by the outnumbering cartel men around them readying their weapons, preparing to back their leader's display. As the crowd became silent once again, the Chancellor regained their attention. He addressed the now seized Russians in his outfit in their own language. "Comrades, your armies have been depleted from one region to the next. Those of you left can choose to work for me or join your friend here on the dirt. You are far away from home, and new recruits are an issue for you. Know this is my home, and my recruits will keep rising. So, the choice is yours." The crowd of men stayed quiet as the Chancellor moved away from Horatio and headed toward the Capitol doors. He turned and looked at all of his men before disappearing into the Capitol building. "Horatio, you have your orders. You may take 2 men with you. The rest of you, our scouts, have found American aircraft heading this way. We have less than 1 hour to move out. Leave the residence." Horatio looked down at the device he was removing from his pocket. It was simply a black GPS receiver with a darkened black screen underneath a thin, cracked glass cover. Within the black screen was a green dot in the center, and at the bordering lower edge of the screen, a red light soundlessly blinked away. Chapter 13. Adrift. Later that day, after the Chancellor had begun evacuating his forces from Esmeralda, about 20 miles southwest, just a few miles below Tansupa, Trevor, Beck, and the two kids were making their way on foot, seeking a vehicle in order to continue their journey. They were all carrying their individual packs of supplies, the same ones they had taken from Gonzalez's truck just one night earlier. While they made their way through the thicket, as they had earlier planned, they kept cover under the nearby jungle, while maintaining a close enough distance to the highway to keep a lookout for any possible working vehicles. It had been several hours since their last vehicle had run out of fuel, and also since they had heard any overhead aircraft in the area. It was nearing afternoon, and throughout the day they had encountered slim showers from the dense storm moving over the coast. The sporadic rain had left the soil damp and had slightly slowed their pace as they made their way through the thick coastal woodlands. It was bright enough to see, but there was no evidence of any sun, as the overcast skies evenly lit up their surroundings in a seemingly permanent state of the most eerie, dull haze. Through these dense jungles, cloudy rays of light were chaotically distributed throughout the vegetation, but were slowly darkened the further in they went. "It's getting late, Trevor. I think they might need a break," Beck remarked as Caleb, just behind her, gave his thoughts on the matter. "I'm hungry," he sighed as he stayed close behind his aunt. Trevor stopped and looked back at the two small kids. He then gave his sister a glance, as if to tell her to join in on his plan, as he turned to Caleb and Delilah once more and began to ease their growing impatience. "Listen, guys. We really don't want to be out here when it gets dark. It would be better if we found a car before then, even if that means just one we could shelter in for the night. As soon as we see something, we'll figure out what to do about some food, okay?" He looked at Beck as they both were growing very aware of the fact that they were now without anyone but the four of them. No food, and no water. Something had to change. They needed to find something, anything. Delilah chimed in, right after Trevor's plea to the group, and stunned both him and Beck. "There's a small truck near the next highway marker. A blue one. It has enough gas to get us to the Salvation." Immediately, the other three were peering into the direction that Delilah was pointing in. As Trevor trained his eyes into the distance that Delilah had pointed him in, he responded, "You mean the small kilometer markers on the sides of the road?" he questioned while letting out a small laugh. "Delilah, how would you know that?" Delilah smiled at Trevor and proudly answered his question. "Kit told me." Trevor then laughed and looked over at his sister, receiving a small smile from her. Then he looked back at Delilah. "And who is Kit?" Delilah looked down at the ground, as if to suddenly become shy as she posed her answer in a softer voice. "My friend." Trevor and Beck gave each other a look, as they both thought it was pleasantly nice that Delilah had such an imagination in such a dark moment like the one they had all currently found themselves in. Their voices slowly trailed off as they carefully made their ways through the unforgiving South American jungles. Meanwhile, a ways up the road and a long, muddy hike through the wilderness, there, upon the shoulder of the narrow, desolate highway where the jungle wildlife met the pavement, sat a highway marker. And as a subtle mist began to take place, it wasn't long before four silhouettes began to appear within the trees and flowing ivy not too far from the shoulder of the road they were staying near. Beck and Trevor continued to keep a close eye out for anything they could remotely identify as a source of transportation, or even a place to get out of the rain from the growing monsoons above. "That's the one," Delilah quietly shouted. Trevor and Beck looked at each other. Beck was now walking at the head of the group, and Trevor was picking up the rear. Then Beck, looking at the marker, entertained Delilah's imagination. "So, "Where's the small truck your friend told you about?" "Over there," Delilah casually answered as she pointed into the jungles, just to the other side of the highway. Beck and Trevor smiled at each other as they looked over to where Delilah had pointed. But then, as they stood there and looked into the dense vegetation across the road, their smiles slowly faded as they each squinted their eyes slightly, attempting to make sense of what they were now seeing. As they both looked on, sure enough, just as the little girl had so simply put, something was there, barely peeking through the leaves within the wilderness. They weren't able to make out much, just a metallic surface of some type showing through the jungle's thicket. A small opening, as the apparent side paneling of a possible vehicle shone with a slight bluish color. Trevor and Beck now gave each other a confused look. Then, both at the same time, looked over at Delilah with even more confusion. "Delilah, when did you talk to Kit?" Beck asked. Both Trevor and Beck now looked at Delilah with anticipation in their eyes. They knew that they couldn't be too careful, and they weren't exactly sure who this Kit character was. Were they someone she had talked to from Vuelta Larga? Was this some kind of twisted trick? One of Santiago's traps he set before he was killed? How did she know this? And who is Kit? They had to be careful, but they also knew they were running out of options, and they couldn't simply walk away from this current windfall. Several hundred feet away, within the trees, sat a blue truck. A vehicle so hidden that if Delilah hadn't said anything, it would not have been discovered. Suddenly, footsteps could be heard approaching as a large crack in the middle of the windshield reflected what little light the stormy skies above had to offer. As the footsteps made their way around the vehicle, a man began surveying his surroundings, seeing if anyone was close by. It was Trevor, and he was now alone. He looked at the vehicle, studying it for any suspicious attributes. It was a much older vehicle, which looked like it was just recently hidden. It was rusting in several places with a mostly intact yet fading blue painted surface. The small SUV housed 5 seats within it and had various items inside, seeming to belong to its owner. It wasn't much, just some maps and tools, and other various belongings. Then he noticed the back seats, littered with empty water bottles. Suddenly, Trevor heard footsteps behind him. He quickly spun around, and there, just a few feet away from him, stood a young Hispanic male. Trevor froze. The man he now looked at was well within striking distance, and he didn't want to initiate a confrontation. The man, now facing him, wore torn blue jeans, a white undershirt, and a thick khaki corduroy jacket. The man seemed unfazed by Trevor, which struck him as odd. He wasn't quite sure what the man was capable of. He wasn't sure if he had any weapons he might soon brandish. And most importantly, as he checked his surroundings with his peripherals, he wasn't sure if this man had any nearby friends that would be joining them. Then, to Trevor's shock, without saying a word, the man simply walked past Trevor, past the vehicle, and into the jungle, leaving Trevor slightly panicked and now confused. He turned and peered through the back window of the small truck, across the interior, and out the opposite window, where he could see the man stumbling about as he seemed to pointlessly wander into the woods. Trevor then noticed the man pull from his coat pocket a bottle of water as the man quickly threw back the remaining liquid inside. And that was when Trevor lowered his gaze to the back seat of the vehicle where several more empty water bottles lay. As bad as Trevor felt for the man, he knew it was too late for him as he kept an eye on where the stranger had disappeared. While doing this, he slowly reached for the front passenger door and began to open it as a few more water bottles fell to the forest floor. And there, in the ignition, was the vehicle's key. Meanwhile, Beck was crouched behind a rock, near Delilah and Caleb. She was peering around it through her pair of binoculars. And then, after waiting some time, she saw Trevor emerge from the forest across the road, signaling her and the kids that the target had been acquired. As Trevor waited, He turned to the vehicle once more and muttered under his breath, "Okay, let's get to work." And within a few moments, the vehicle sounded off. The four now inside as it slowly made its way up the muddy vegetation, back to the nearby E15, leaving in its wake a messy patch of consumed, tainted water bottles Trevor and Beck had removed before their departure. Once in full motion, the car made a large U-turn and continued down the highway. As it slowly disappeared, the calm stillness of the forest took hold of the vacant expressway as small drops of rain began descending on the quieting pavement. "This thing is 3/4 full," Trevor said, while behind the wheel as his face beamed with joy. "This can get us all the way there." Beck smiled as she looked at her brother and then back at the kids. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos, gaining Trevor's attention. "Isn't that the rainwater we collected earlier?" "I thought we used it all," he said, receiving a rather quick response from his sister. "I refilled it from the runoff of a rock while we were waiting for you." She then reached back and handed the thermos to Caleb, who took his turn and quickly handed it over to Delilah. Upon pleasing the children and their thirst, Beck turned back around in her seat and once again reached down to her feet, this time pulling out a map they had been given the night before. "We still have another 325 miles left to go. What is that, like 8 hours?" Beck asked her brother. Trevor thought about his sister's estimation and agreed with her. "Yeah, something like that. Maybe 8, 9 at the most, I'd say." Beck thought to herself, reflecting on their current find. Although for years, things really hadn't made much sense. However, this paled in comparison to the last couple of days. And he just walked away. Trevor had his answer ready. It didn't seem difficult to him. "Yeah, he must have been bathing in the stuff." "Jesus Christ," Beck stated. "That could have been us. I drank a few of the bottles they gave me." "Me too," Trevor remarked. "She also said to stay off the highway," Delilah noted from the back seat. Once again, Trevor and Beck looked at each other. This time, they didn't laugh Delilah's comments off as pure imagination as Beck looked back at the small girl and posed a question. "Who? Your friend, Kit?" she asked. Delilah looked at Beck and laughed. "Yes, she told me that when she told me about the truck. Stay off the highway." Trevor and Beck looked at each other. Then they looked over at the impossibly thick jungle when Trevor finally chimed in. "I think it's too thick for us to drive through, sweetie. With this rain, we might even get stuck." Delilah looked out the window at the darkening wilderness. She was recently in herself. As she let her eyes wander, for a quick and fleeting moment, she noticed a darkened figure within the trees as she responded to Trevor. "Yeah, plus I don't like it in there. It's scary." Trevor and Beck, however, weren't letting it go as easily as the small child in the back seat, sitting next to her brother, had done. They looked at each other silently, wondering how accurate this little girl's friend just might be. Trying to shake it off, convincing themselves that their vehicle they'd found wasn't a product of some imaginary friend, and instead was just an amazing coincidence. And knowing that the dense jungles on either side seemed to pose much more risk, they both looked off into the distant road ahead, wondering what their journey had in store. As they proceeded down the highway, the afternoon sun was now beginning to make its descent, announcing to the earth below a cold and rainy evening was on the way. Some rays of sunlight began beaming through the overcast skies, creating refractions of light through the rain, which formed a dispersion of different shades of colors across the skies above. The four made their way down the E15 as a state of ease pleasantly swept through their newly acquired vehicle. "You should try to get some rest, Beck, while I'm driving. Then we can take shifts." "Sounds good to me. Wake me up when we're halfway." The conversation then slowed as the four travelers continued their journey south. That evening, when the sun was beginning to set, tucking itself in for the night within the distant Pacific horizon, the kids were asleep as Beck watched the beautiful colors in the sky change from vibrant oranges and reds to muted purples and pinks. She watched as the overcast skies simply turned dark without a star in the sky, as a dull full moon lit up the curtain of clouds below it. Trevor had been sleeping now for almost 3 hours. Beck felt as if they were making good time. After all, they still had a day and a half left, and they were only about an hour from their target. Trevor had a tendency to toss and turn in his sleep, which is why she could tell he needed the rest, as his motionless body lay curled up next to her, almost completely silent. While she drove, she pondered the recent weeks. She thought of her grandfather. She remembered sitting on his lap when she was just a little girl. She remembered visiting him at his lake house and sitting on the dock with her younger brother. She remembered showing him how to properly skip a smooth stone across the water's surface. How to throw it just right. A delicate flick of the wrist as the stone would sail off, gracefully bouncing along its glassy path, ultimately sinking into the water itself. She then thought of Anne and Eugene, how they were such a driving force within their small team, how they lucked upon them when she was taken by a group of Russians. Anne was always pretty quiet, but she was always ready to help wherever it was needed. And Eugene, his expertise with computers and electronics, had come in handy through some of their most dire moments. Then, as she was deep in thought, her eyes began to well up as an image of Seth slowly crossed her mind. Watching the sheer and utter painful death he had gone through right before her very eyes, unable to do anything about it. Then, as the road in front of her began to slowly darken, she snapped out of her gloomy daze, while the last sliver of sunlight cued her to turn on her high beams, lighting up the pavement as they made their way through the small coastal town of Montanita. A large bend of freeway laid in front of her as she began to calculate how much gas they would need to complete their trip. She felt they had less than an hour to travel and had about 1/8 of a tank. She smiled as she felt confident this amount of fuel should be just enough to get them through. Just then, she noticed a dark void on the freeway about a half-mile ahead. Since they began, it wasn't rare to come across abandoned cars here and there. But now, with the lack of light, this felt much different. She knew she was just being paranoid, so she didn't bother waking her brother, while she let her foot off the gas slightly and decreased her speed. She wanted to get a closer look at the object in the road ahead, and she figured she could do this if she maintained a lower speed. Going now about 55 miles an hour, the object was getting closer, and her paranoia was fading as she did not see anything out of the ordinary. The obstacle seemed to be in the middle of the freeway, not uncommon, however slightly nerve-wracking as darkness settled around her. About quarter mile or so to go before surpassing the incoming hurdle, Beck's confidence swept back in, as she was now close enough to see with her headlights that a threat seemed unlikely. Then, as a sweet and sour medley of flavors would jar one's taste, so did Beck's emotions as her confidence swiftly turned to apprehension. Suddenly, without warning, their blue Suburban was flooded in light from the vehicles ahead. She began to brake as panic set in. Thoughts began to flood her mind as the loudest thought directed her next choice. She needed to wake her brother. As she began to let her brother's name fall from her lips, she heard an echoing, piercing sound come from the distance. She attempted to swerve and avoid the threat from the familiar sound, but immediately felt a cold sensation flood her body while the shattering of glass sounded before her as she was forced back against her seat, while the world around her slowly turned dark. The truck's front wheels made an immediate and sudden shift to the right, joined with the 50 miles an hour it had been traveling, and catapulted itself across the few lanes of blacktop. Flipping itself into a tumble, it landed back on its tires and drifted to the side of the road, smacking into a tree. The chaotic sounds abruptly ended as steam from within the engine began bellowing out of its loosened hood's frame. Trevor slowly began coming to while regaining his focus. His balance gave him a sensation of unease as he slowly realized that the vehicle was at an extreme slant. He felt his forehead as he noticed a new gash. His fingers passed while sliding them across his face. Looking through his bloody and blurry vision, he peered at his own blood on his hands that he had swept from his brow. He looked over at his sister, who was pressed up against her door. "Beck," he whispered, unable to speak any louder from the strange pains he now felt across his entire body. "Beck, are you okay, Beck?" But, not hearing her answer, he slowly raised his head in an attempt to see her face through his bloodied and blurry vision. As he scanned his sister pressed up against the driver's side door, he called to her once more. "Beck," but then, trying to focus on her face, now coming into view as he strained his eyes while attempting to ignore the pulses of pain now surging through his head, his heart began to sink once more. And there, upon her face, a gaping, blackened wound replacing the area where her left eye had once been. An apparent bullet hole now fixed upon his sister's brow. And as he began to muster up his strength to try to call her name one last time, his attention was drawn to his right side, just outside his door. Still in shock and tremendous pain, he managed to look over and noticed, standing outside the vehicle, now with no window separating himself from the open air, a man darkened by the night and the surrounding woods. There was no time for any reaction, as he heard the man quickly say something that seemed to rattle in his mind, not making any sense, as he saw the butt of a rifle approach his head. "A gift from my dad, motherfucker." With that, the rifle's end made a heavy impact with his forehead as everything around him seemed to fade away, while an icy hot sensation rang through his skull.
The sky I'll carry home, home to the mountain leaves, and soon, my friend, you'll see them again. Won't you lift me high? The won't you lift me high? And I'll sing for you all the way home.
Several years earlier, the skies were dark over the Atlantic seas, while flashes of lightning flickered within their misty confines of the nearby heavy clouds. A few United States F-16s made their way through the murky atmosphere while closely monitoring their surroundings as they escorted the large Boeing 747, also known as Air Force One, through the murky and stormy night skies. Without a specific agenda at hand, several top officials held an intensively heated security briefing regarding the recent atrocities that had occurred upon their nation's soil. A very well-lit area near the nose of the plane and underneath the cockpit was a room dressed in mahogany walls and brass trimmings, as a vociferous debate continued to unfold within its walls. Around a large oak table within the heavenly Oval Office sat President Letitia Jackson, a well-spoken, older African-American woman within her third year in office. Her wavy, strikingly jet-black hair was held back by a clip behind her head as she held a serious expression while demanding answers for the latest security failures. She had dark skin, which helped highlight her piercing hazel eyes, while she carried a confidence with her that had a record of sparking results, as she demanded strategy from the team around her. Sitting across from her, Vice President Stephen Brady, a much younger Caucasian man with blonde hair and green eyes, sat quietly awaiting his turn to be addressed. Next to him sat a man that the White House had been closely working with for several years. His name was Alex Channing, and he was the nation's leading contagion expert. Behind these two gentlemen stood several high-ranking military personnel. Among them was the most decorated of them all, the General of the Air Force, General Casey Beckett, who was currently under attack by the President's stern accusations. General Beckett, you had assured my staff that dark scope, while still in its test phase, would be safe to use as long as we had specific targets and we manually overrode the AI to maintain control of each individual warhead. With all due respect, General, these reports don't convey the same message, Letitia stated as she pored over the documents, freshly printed and now strewn across her desk. She continued to publicly admonish the high-ranking officer as she proceeded with a lecturing tone. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, D.C., Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro. The list goes on and on. These are not targets recorded in the briefing just several hours ago. The targets that were ordered were intended to be centered over large military operations within the Russian and Chinese borders. Instead, even though severely crippling them, we are literally being plummeted into the dark ages, as we've apparently systematically wiped out our entire continent's power grid, leveling our largest cities and military strongholds. And who knows the fallout this will create? Power grids across the entire planet are likely to be wiped out, General. This is exactly what the Russian and Chinese militaries needed to gain the advantage: chaos. Beckett immediately interrupted to fortify a quick defense as he pointed to one of the documents on the President's desk. Yes, Madam President, I fully understand your frustration. However, these are not our codes. While they are still within the guidelines of the Department of Defense's formatting, they are simply not ours. It's as if another component tampered with the codes before reaching Dark Scope's apparatus. The AI is simply unable to override any authentic manual commands, he answered as he began to inform the President of his department's assessment on the breach. We have successfully tracked the backlogs of the program and found a code inside it that has been laying there for years. It's not Russian or Chinese. We thought it might be Iranian, but then we came across this, he said as he rifled through the clutter of pages on the desk between them. This isn't the first time we've come along this dialect. Several years ago, one of my men sent a transmission like this over to headquarters before he was forced to self-detonate deep underground in one of our South American labs. Zancudo. At that point, Mr. Channing spoke up. My brother, Salvador, was with him, Madam President. He died in that blast. He'd been studying a specimen there for several years. Madam President, we believe this to be the same dialect as my brother's specimen. They were able to triangulate coordinates of the specimen's origin through ongoing sessions and decoding. Our hacker appears to be from a small planet, Darius of Alpha Centauri. As the President closed her eyes, a sense of helpless anger became apparent to the officials around her as the General began to speak once again. This wasn't the most disturbing information we discovered, Madam President. The hacker had localized technical support. Our intel led us to these two men. It came from an informant we made several years ago. A contact we have yet to contain, so we're not sure exactly what their motive is. We're just certain that her information is always accurate, he said as he took out a couple photographs and placed them on the desk before the President, and continued. Thanks to this informant's information, the CIA and FBI were closing in on these targets, but they had no reason to execute their mission as they were yet to see any illegal motives for their activities. Until now. Madam President, these were two of the most high-ranking officers in the CIA before they moved on to being private contractors. We believe they are now working closely with the hostile outsiders. And last but not least, we recently received this. The general pulled out another paper from his pocket and placed it before her. It's their last transmission monitored by the two cooperating agencies. The president looked at the transcript, which was obviously printed from a fax machine, and then posed a question. What do we know about this informant? The general then answered, we're not sure of her affiliation or rank, but she goes by some kind of code name. At least, that's what we're assuming. Calls herself Kit. President looked at the general with disappointment in her eyes as she read the words on the document before her, quietly, to herself. It had been addressed to a Mr. Shields and was from a man named Mr. Brooks. And it read, Mr. Shields, our client has advised me that there was a flaw inside the code within their virus. Apparently, a small percentage of the infected can identify the loss prevention agents known as cattle guards. I have provided you the defect of this weak spot in a disk you will soon receive. Once you run it through the database, it should allow you to identify and evaluate the targets. The client would like you to cull this population. Eliminate the threat, Mr. Shields. Arlo. Beckett continued speaking as the presence of hair-raising energy began drifting through the plane's cabin. Both of these men are at the top of their pay grades. They are very hard to track, and they work on a contractual basis with the CIA. They are even known to have body doubles around the world. Some say they're not exactly body doubles, but some kind of mutation from a compound we've been briefed on called DX4. Whatever they are, they're even used on their own families, spending time with their kids and becoming intimate with their spouses. They wrote the playbook on the modern era of the espionage industry and have been crucial assets. However, it appears they are extremely ruthless. Letitia peered back to the photographs, trying to connect the dots as the general continued speaking. Their names are Thomas Shields and Arlo Brooks. And this picture of Thomas Shields, although unbeknownst to the officials aboard Air Force One, was the same man that was once within Trevor's team, below them on the ground. It was Seth's father. Chapter 14, Malice. Trevor now found himself in a darkened haze. A haze that brought with it the cold realities of the events that had just transpired. After being attacked through his shattered window, he didn't remember much. But one thing that he did remember played over and over within his mind, like a relentless nightmare seeping through his entire being, controlling every thought. And as he slowly began to regain his bearings, he looked around within the quagmire that used to be their only way out of this cat and mouse scenario. Him and his companions had been trapped in over the last couple of weeks. As he mustered up the courage to look upon his sister once more, he tried to shake his most recent image of her, rattling within his head, hoping it was perhaps just a bad dream. But to Trevor's dismay, as he once again peered over at Beck, just like before, there, where her eye had once been, a bullet wound was now instead. "Beck," he whispered. "Beck, no. Please, no." And as a tear began to slip from his own eye, a hint of hope washed over his face as he immediately drew his attention back to his sister. He could hear her trying to speak. "Beck," he whispered once more. As he held his gaze intently upon her lips, he could see them slightly move in another attempt to speak once more. But then, whisking him swiftly away from a hopeful demeanor, horror set in as Beck quickly sat up and lunged at her brother, sitting in the passenger seat of the now defunct vehicle, and met him face to face. Blood now dripping from her gaping wound onto Trevor as she let out a few unnerving words. "Wake up, Trevor. You must save them. You must save yourself." Trevor was suddenly punched in the gut, bringing him out of his brief, dark dream. And as a man withdrew his fist, Trevor regained consciousness, his hands now tied behind him, leaning against a tree. The vehicle now, not in sight. It was dark and very cold as he tried to focus his sights. The man who had assaulted him was just a dark silhouette as he stepped back at the sight of Trevor awakening. Just then, another man stepped forward and kneeled down near him and spoke. "Wake up, Trevor." The stranger then reached behind him and grabbed a duffel bag that Trevor immediately recognized. It was the one he had been carrying for the last day or so. It was one they had found amongst other bags in a vehicle, back at Vuelta Larga, the one they had unwittingly stole from a cartel soldier hiding out nearby after being set free by the American forces. The man then used a knife as he cut one of the seams of the bag and pulled out a small, thin black object with a blinking red light. The man leaned into Trevor and spoke with a lowered voice. "We have eyes everywhere." Trevor, now knowing that this sadistic cat and mouse game was back in play, rolled his eyes, partially with frustration, leaving the remainder of his expression defined by utter confusion. He tossed his head back, causing a small sound as he hit the tree behind him. He winced in pain from the bruising he had incurred from the prior, thrashing accident, joined with a new discomfort from the most recent assault. His aggressor began speaking once more, while Trevor noticed two men standing behind the stranger. "I know what you're thinking. Is she dead?" he said as he leaned in closer. He looked at Trevor while pointing at his own left eye as he proceeded to devilishly regale his hostage of the gut-wrenching demise of his fallen sister. The bullet went through this eye. It was shot quite a distance away, so the thermal scope was very useful. Although, once hitting the glass, and then having to also penetrate a human skull, the bullet was slowed down significantly. "I'm afraid it's still in your sister's head." As the man said this, Trevor noticed laughing coming from the men behind the man speaking. He began to look around as his focus was finally beginning to sharpen, and also as his captor continued speaking. "I don't think you need to worry about her anymore. If I were you, I would worry about the little boy in the car. I fear his wounds may cause him to die. After all, that was a terrible accident you and your family just went through. Do you think it might help if I remove the large piece of glass from his neck? No, I know. You can do that after digging through your sister's little skull. I'd like to save the bullet. You know, for sentimental reasons." Trevor could hear the laughing continue as his rage grew within him. He began to feel this rage settle in as he kept trying to piece together anything he could do to get Caleb and Delilah away from this place. Far, far away. It was very dark as he looked at the grassy soil around him, surrounded by trees to one side and the bank leading up to the expressway on the other. He noticed a rock protruding from the dirt right next to him as one of the men crossed over his field of vision, carrying a pistol strapped to his thigh. Then he began to take in a small sense of hope as he moved his hands around in the dirt behind him and stumbled across what felt like a rather sharp rock. "This one, though," the man continued. "I think we might keep her. My men get so lonely. You understand, right?" That's when he saw Delilah for the first time. Barely able to make out her face from the moon's dull glow, he could tell that she was crying. Then, one of the other men pulled her by the hand as they threw her onto the ground. The man who threw her kneeled down by her and caressed her long hair while grasping a knife, as its sharp edge grazed the small child's face, looking to Trevor with a sinister grin. Trevor gripped the sharp rock, while an intense sensation of murderous anger swept through his body. His face grew angry as he looked at the man in front of him, now addressing Trevor once more. "I don't know about you, but I think she's going to grow into a beautiful woman someday, if she makes it that long. I don't know, though. Your group has surprised us before. She might be like you, a little fighter. We might have to spend some time really brainwashing this one. If she's anything like her role models, she could be a good asset. You know, amongst other things," he said as he looked back at his men who were still laughing quietly, one still holding the little girl down. Then he looked back to Trevor and continued his sick monologue. "What do you think, Trev? You think this one has some fight in her?" Trevor was listening to the men continue to laugh as his anger only grew more inside him. He looked at his shadowy enemy and responded with a snarl in his breath, pain in his posture, and disdain in his words. "Fuck you," he muttered, while wincing from the pain he was feeling. "I'm gonna kill all of you." No one moved in response to Trevor's remarks. They just looked at one another and laughed, the leader of the small group refocusing on their prisoner. "And how do you see that happening, my friend?" Trevor finally matched their menacing expressions as a smile filled with pure hatred slowly stretched across his bloody face. He continued to speak while looking at each one of them, making sure they all felt included in his plan. "First, I'm gonna knock that guy out cold," he said while nodding his direction at one of the men, causing his aggressor to look in the same direction and then back at his hostage as Trevor continued. "Then I'm gonna stab that one in the throat. And then, finally," he stated, pausing for a moment and smiling more confidently. And as his smile reached its maximum, he proceeded foretelling their fates. "Then I'm going to make you eat your own fucking gun." This time, the leader of the three showed a slight hint of hesitation, having witnessed his hostage's capabilities in the recent weeks, as he pathetically tried hiding it with his menacing laughter and ordered one of his men to secure Trevor. "Tighten his bounds. We can't take any chances with this one." One of the men, listening to his commander, crossed in front of his boss and began walking around Trevor as he passed between the two. Trevor took advantage of his window and stretched his legs out and clasped the man's feet with his legs, and then drew them quickly back, causing the man to fall face forward. The man then fell flat on his face next to Trevor, slamming his forehead into a nearby protruding rock. Fragments of bone, painted red from dripping blood, broke around the rock's sharp edges. And as soon as this happened, the leader backed off to retrieve his weapon as the man that once had Delilah in his grips let go of the little girl and sprung towards Trevor in an attempt to subdue their hostage. But Trevor effortlessly rose to his feet as a rush of adrenaline took over. And causing the man to stop dead in his tracks, Trevor faced his enemy's advance as he pulled both of his now freed hands from around his back with a sharp rock still in one, and immediately closing the distance between him and his attacker. Not letting a second slip by, allowing his enemies to think, he lunged towards the threat. He pushed his fist forward, clutching the sharp rock, and slit his enemy's throat with his newly acquired shiv. As he heard the sound of a gun being readied, he embraced the man he had just slaughtered, pulled him to his own body, not allowing the dying man to fall to the ground, and turned into the direction of the noise. And using the nearly dead body like a shield, the gun finally sounded off, sending a bullet toward Trevor, but only hitting the shooter's comrade instead. Once the small piece of metal penetrated the corpse, Trevor threw the carcass aside and advanced toward his final enemy. And as he tackled the last man, forcing the two into a tumble through the grass, another shot sounded off. Trevor had been shot in the gut. The man then tightened his grip around his gun, attempting to retrain it on his escaped hostage and deliver another blow as they tumbled through the jungle. They wrestled for several seconds until finally a shot was fired as another bullet sank into Trevor's left side just above his waist. But, as if unfazed from the ordeal of being shot now twice, Trevor kept fighting, slowly overpowering the man, eventually gaining control of his captor's hands still gripping the gun. And though the other man was still holding the weapon, Trevor forced his hands to turn it on himself as his enemy let out a yell. Trevor then kneeled on his adversary's chest as the man was quickly met with his own gun being shoved forcefully into his mouth. He pushed the gun in as far as he could, while letting out sounds only one could describe as animalistic or psychotic. Finally, as he now held the gun down the throat of his enemy, he leaned in and spoke. "I hope you burn." And with that, he squeezed the trigger, ushering a bullet through the skull of the man he now held down under his knees. It was a peaceful dawn over the desolate town of Valdivia as the early morning sun, unlike the day before, effortlessly made its way through the clear skies, beckoning the hours of mid-morning. After the storm had rolled through, the soil of the jungles let off a familiar aroma one might recognize as an after-rain perfume. The open sea air swept through the trees and orchestrated a symphony of calm as leaves fluttered about the jungle's canopy. The woodland grounds were dutifully in sync with their skyward neighbors, as wild birds continued their chirping in the distance, composing a song of profound serenity. Alongside the edge of the forest lay a strip of grassy embankment that ran along a deserted and once scenic highway. Upon this strip of muddy grass, Trevor, barely stumbling along, while holding a gun with his left hand and shouldering a sickly pale Caleb with his right, made his way on foot. Delilah, now walking right next to him, looked at Trevor with fear in her eyes as his wounds in his stomach, now bandaged with cloth, ripped from his enemy's clothes just hours ago, continuously bled out. As the trio made their way, Trevor and Delilah each held a somber silence. His lower half was completely drenched in blood as he periodically checked his poorly wrapped wound by rubbing his fingers along it. The three continued along, leaving droplets of blood dripping down the blades of grass they passed over. Delilah kept her eye on Trevor, every now and then looking up at him. But his face was always the same. Though she kept hearing signs of discomfort come from her uncle, he never changed his facial expression, always calm and focused on the path ahead of them. But then, something did change. She began to hear sounds coming from behind them as she turned around and looked. Trevor, too, focused on walking and keeping his injuries from his mind, followed her lead to see what she had heard. The sight nearly made him vomit as he looked off into the distance and saw a convoy of vehicles racing their way. He looked to Delilah, cueing her to follow his lead as they began running. He peered over at the forest and contemplated ducking for cover, but could not imagine negotiating the mildly rough terrain in his condition. He could not think of a better plan as he gently set Caleb on the ground and checked his gun for a bullet count. Suddenly becoming very dizzy, He lost his balance and hit the dirt, landing right next to Caleb. And as he clutched the little boy's dying body, he reached out for Delilah's hand while dropping his gun in the process. As he looked at her, not knowing if she was looking back as his vision had become severely blurry and distorted, he managed to get out one final word. "Run." He didn't remember much after that, except for strangely lying on the highway. But didn't he collapse on the grass? He thought to himself, and who is this? And as he faded in and out, he noticed a blurry figure now kneeling over him. His hearing was coming and going, but he made sense of a few of the words that were being spoken around him. "Clean. This one's clean too. Get him in with the others." A large portion of the current events were not making any sense, and he wanted it all to end, as he felt himself being carried away on what felt like a stretcher of some kind. He was tired of getting free just to be caught again. But then, just as he needed it the most, a small hand reached out and grabbed two of his fingers. He felt Delilah, and he felt her walking next to him as he saw he was being carried by multiple American soldiers. A smile slowly made its way across his face, which just seemed to make his wounds hurt even more. But he couldn't care less. Then, he finally managed to get out a few small words before passing out. "Where's Caleb?" One of the soldiers looked down at him and replied, "Medic has him. They're working on him right now. Just rest. We're almost there." Just then, everything around him seemed to grow dark as a large hovering aircraft made its way over his head. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. The aircraft must have been the size of a large stadium. His eyes closed as he managed to hear a few last words from a soldier before going unconscious. "There she is. There's sanctuary." Trevor now found himself in a peaceful environment as he looked out toward the lake and admired how the sunlight washed over its surface while ripples of traveling waves carried the light's reflection with an effortless sense of grace. Ever since he could remember, from being a small boy, his family would come here for some time, away from the rest of the busy world around them. He looked back in an attempt to gain his bearings as he gazed at his grandfather's lake house. It was surrounded by the large ponderosa pine trees that gathered in tight clusters throughout the surrounding forest. While he peered at the cabin, a familiar sense of calm swept through his body as he became comfortable, as if a security blanket of childhood memories seemed to cloak him in a tight embrace. When Trevor switched his gaze back to the pier, a rush of warmth overtook him as he laid his eyes on his older sister, now sitting at the edge of the dock, her blonde hair radiantly glowing in the sun like an angel. He found the small walk to his sister to be somewhat cathartic, as he knew this was some kind of dream, yet reveled in the mere sight of her as he came closer. Now, standing next to her, he peered out into the lake and enjoyed the beauty of the watery surface with his older sister, as they allowed a calming silence to dominate their reunion for a brief moment. "I always loved the sunset here," Beck said. She kept her view on the lake's glossy surface. "I remember we would fall asleep right here as the sun disappeared behind those mountains." Trevor looked down at his sister, fully understanding her description of the childhood memory they had often shared together. He slowly took a seat next to her just inches away, not wanting the mirage to disappear by disturbing the memories, now materializing before him. He continued to look out at the water, matching the sights his sister held within his own mind as he responded to her with a hushed tone. "Mom and Dad would let us sleep out here every night," he said as he looked over at her. He noticed her relaxed, peaceful smile, which seemed to upset him, as it reminded him that it was a sight that was quickly being removed from his life forever. As he looked down, he saw her hands gently gripping a smooth rock as she spoke of their sublime memories they shared together as she continued to speak. "They'll always be here, Trevor," somewhere out there at the bottom. We did that together. Trevor looked at her, unable to speak. He wanted to beg her to not throw the stone, worried with an intense fear that it would quickly usher the end to his small reunion with his departed older sibling. Instead, all he could do was manage a few words to creep past the thick lump, now swollen within his throat, as a tear began to slip from the corner of his left eye. "I don't want to go through this without you," he said, as he looked back down at his trembling hands. He listened closely to her next words, as fear of his sister never talking to him again began to take its utterly depressive hold over his entire being. "I love you, Trev. Others need you now. Your journey isn't over. You need to let me go. You need to be there for them. You don't know how important they really are." And then, causing him to look at her with confusion, she looked over and said a few more words. "You aren't in a good place, Trev. They still have you. You need to get out. You need to get everybody out." More tears ran down his face, as he couldn't even begin to question the puzzling words she spoke, as his confused face did all the talking. He peered over to his sister, but now found himself sitting on the docks of his childhood memories, quiet and helplessly alone. Beck was now gone. Then he looked out into the distance as he saw a smooth stone plunk into the water's still surface, causing a slight disturbance within its glassy entrance. It had been several weeks since they were rescued. Trevor stood there in the grass as he held a quiet gaze. He was wearing thin cloth pants. He could still feel a bandage on one of his calves underneath them, where a GPS tracker had recently been surgically removed. And Delilah, at his side, held his hand as they both stood in silence while they looked at the ground. Both wearing their new clothes and staring at the ground together, Delilah decided to break the silence. "I think it's pretty," she said, while not looking away from the ground. Trevor agreed in response. "I think you're right, Delilah," he said as he looked over at her with a small smile and then back to the tiny gravesite below them. The small grave was comprised of a modest-sized grassy mound with a short stone slab erected in the middle of the tiny hill. Trevor looked over as he noticed Caleb reaching up for his opposite hand while smiling up at his uncle. He looked down at the small boy, who still had a bandage wrapped around his neck, and said a few words. "I think your Aunt Beck will love our new home. Even if her body is not physically here, she'll always be with us." He looked back and forth, from one small child to the other, and continued. "Now you guys can come here anytime you want to talk to her. Or talk to any of them, okay?" They stood there, as silence once again wrapped them in its warm embrace, while they admired the thin stone slab. On it, crudely etched with a blade of a knife, read the names of all their loved ones they had lost along the way. From top to bottom, it read, in loving memory, Beck, Seth, Jack, and Eugene, and finally, Thomas. Trevor then peered at the sky. It was overcast. It was always overcast. This new place they were in, although safe as it seemed, always held a dark, cloudy sky above. He was in a small, newly constructed neighborhood. The houses, all very small, each were identical. As he scanned the neighborhood, he noticed the other homes, exactly as his, a few rooms with a small back porch. And as they stood there together upon that small porch, Trevor noticed something beyond his small fence amidst a few bushes, a figure peering at him. He then noticed a figure gesture to him, pressing its finger to its lips. He looked around him to see if the kids were seeing the same thing he was, as he looked back toward the shadowy silhouette. Not wanting to alarm the little ones, Trevor slowly walked them inside the house. "I'll be right back, okay?" he said, closing them in and slowly looking back. But when he did, the figure was gone. Then, suddenly, without warning, it had re-emerged right on Trevor's patio, just feet away from where he stood. The figure was wearing thin brown cloth pants and a thin brown cloak with a hood. And then, as the stranger pulled his hood back, a face came into focus. It was a black man who held a strong jawline and was clean-shaven. "I know you see them. We can see them too," the man said, as Trevor's intrigue now spiked beyond definable words. "You want to know who they are?" Trevor looked at the man while completely at a loss for words. He had so many questions. This was the first time anyone else had witnessed the dark figures that seemed to follow him from place to place. The stranger snapped Trevor from his trance as he began to speak once more. "Well," the stranger said as Trevor stared at him in a silent state of shock. Finally, he was able to manage a quick nod in response to the man's proposal as the stranger continued. "The dark objects you are seeing aren't really there. Chasing them would be like chasing a rainbow. You can see the colors fine, but as you move, the colors shift and become more distorted, eventually disappearing altogether. It's a computer program projecting itself across its investments. It's security software, kind of like loss prevention." The stranger kept speaking, every word scratching the back of Trevor's mind, reminding him of a dream he had once had. "We call them cattle guards. They're not able to actually do anything other than surveillance, but that doesn't mean they're not dangerous. They can raise alarms, so I'm sure you can understand the benefits of having this ability to see them. Having this ability, though, is something that only a few possess. You see, these so-called open pastures back on Earth were too frightful for humans to handle. Assets were lost. If they weren't lost, they were often damaged. The Russians and cartels were not the ideal farmers. They leaned too heavily on their typical authoritarian-style management. Eventually, their client terminated the contract, turned to the Americans. Hopefully, for a more sustainable farm and more competent farmer. Trevor's mind began racing more than before. Back on Earth? Cattle guard? What was this stranger going on about? And why the hell was it eerily reminding Trevor of some kind of lost truth he once knew? The stranger continued speaking as Trevor listened more closely than he had ever listened to anyone before. "That's right. We're not on Earth any longer. We are on a planet within the Alpha Centauri star system. Right now, you and I, and those little ones in your home. We're all on another planet, a planet called Darius." This put Trevor a little too far over his comfort zone, within theories he wasn't quite ready to be convinced of. This is the new open pasture, completely isolated, where they have full control. And when I say they, I don't mean these American soldiers. It's someone else who really sits at the top between all the different militarized forces and this client they all are vying for. A man named Arlo Brooks. Trevor's eyes opened as an expression of fear ran its course along his face, escorting with it a state of panic that began to take hold of his entire being as he asked himself several perplexing questions. Is it possible I'm really on another planet? Is this really not over? Questions stacked up with increasing speed as Trevor looked over at the man once more. But when he did, the man had disappeared. Suddenly, Trevor heard a loud knock as he peered into his home through a window, where he saw Delilah and Caleb now focusing their attention on the front door. Trevor was immediately met with a feeling of unease as he re-entered his home through the back. What the hell was going on? Was he losing his mind? It all seemed to be so surreal. As he slowly made his way into his home, he quietly closed the door behind him and began walking across his living room, while Caleb and Delilah wondered who it could be. He continued his path to the front door as his overflowing mind continued reeling. Who could this be? Eventually coming to the door, where they had all heard the obvious sounds of someone knocking, he paused. And realizing there still hadn't been a second knock, he thought to himself. Perhaps the visitor had left. But then, suddenly, and causing Trevor to slightly flinch, another round of knocking sounded off. He now looked down at the kids and gave them each a reassuring smile and slowly reached out to open it. And as the door began to open, a man came into view. That was when the hair on Trevor's neck began to stand on edge, as the man on the other side of the open door was now fully in Trevor's sights. It was a blond man with glasses and a mustache. He was wearing his typical businesslike attire, sporting a jet black trench coat. And as Trevor's expression swiftly changed to complete and utter awe and shock, he recognized this man as an old companion of his. A father of a dear friend he once had. It was Seth's deceased dad, Thomas, and he now stood before Trevor, completely unscathed and in good health. And while holding a focused gaze upon this impossible sight, Thomas then greeted Trevor with a few choice words. "Good evening, Mr. Meeks. You and I need to talk."